"Be careful where you step." The words slipped out from a cracked voice, barely audible over the bustle of the city street, yet they cut through the clatter of footsteps, the distant rumble of traffic, and the flickering neon lights that painted the sidewalks in shifting hues of red and blue. James Carter, a 50-year-old homeless man with dark skin, sat huddled against the cold concrete wall of an alley, his worn coat pulled tightly around his shoulders and a ragged blanket half covering his knees, eyes scanning the moving crowd with a quiet intensity that made it seem as though he could read every gesture, every expression, every hurried glance. His hand rested on the edge of a discarded cardboard sign, smudged with faded writing, yet his attention was elsewhere, drawn to the clatter of a briefcase dropping near the curb and the startled gasp of a man stepping back just in time. Robert Whitman, a white man in his mid-40s, dressed in a tailored suit slightly rumpled from his rush through the streets, paused mid-stride, his face a mixture of surprise and embarrassment as he bent to retrieve the item, unaware of the uneven pavement and puddle forming nearby. The crowd moved past them in waves, some glancing curiously, others oblivious, the urban scent of exhaust, street food, and distant rain mixing with the faint smell of damp concrete. James shifted slightly, moving with quiet deliberation, his eyes never leaving Robert, calculating the precise moment to act without drawing attention, a small act that could make a critical difference. The reflection of neon signs shimmered in puddles at their feet, casting irregular patterns of light across James's face, highlighting lines etched from years of hardship and resilience, his expression calm yet alert, betraying experience and an uncanny awareness of the chaos around him. Robert straightened, glancing around nervously as if sensing the subtle tension in the space they occupied, the city suddenly quieter in his perception, each distant siren, each distant shout, each footfall exaggerated in his ears. James extended a hand subtly, a silent gesture, as though inviting caution and mindfulness without alarming the man who had not yet recognized the true depth of his observation. The air held a gentle chill, carrying the muted scent of wet asphalt and the faint sweetness of roasting chestnuts from a nearby vendor, blending into the urban symphony of sound and movement. In the brief moment before contact, time seemed to stretch, the city blurring at the edges, yet the clarity between James and Robert sharpened, a fragile connection formed through instinct and attention, a readiness that could prevent misstep or mishap. People passed, heads down, conversations clipped, the neon flicker creating shadows that moved like dancers across the wet pavement, highlighting the subtle difference between those who observed and those who were oblivious. James breathed steadily, measured and precise, his posture relaxed but prepared, each slight movement deliberate, a rhythm tuned to the city's pulse, waiting for the moment when a simple act of awareness could transform a routine street crossing into a life-altering encounter. Robert's eyes met James's for a fraction of a second, recognition flickering in the briefest glance, an unspoken understanding that the city held unseen dangers and unnoticed guardians, and the ordinary street became a stage where the invisible yet deliberate intervention of a single attentive man could ripple outward, altering the course of a day and perhaps, for reasons neither fully understood yet, the course of life itself. The city sidewalk stretched out under the late morning sun, bustling with people whose attention was mostly fixed on their own routines, leaving James Carter partially hidden in plain sight along the edge of the street, his dark coat frayed at the edges, worn shoes scuffed, the blanket folded neatly beside him as if marking his small territory. He moved with quiet purpose, collecting discarded bottles and cleaning up the area around a curb, hands steady and precise, while keeping his eyes alert for anything unusual, every small sound drawing his attention. Steam rose from a nearby manhole, curling into the air and mingling with the smells of fresh bread from a corner bakery, gasoline from passing cars, and the faint hint of wet asphalt, creating a layered sensory backdrop that he navigated effortlessly. Passers-by occasionally glanced his way, some curious, some indifferent, yet James remained undisturbed, his calm presence contrasting sharply with the hurried movements and clipped conversations around him. He paused briefly to offer a cup of water to a stray dog that had been following him silently, the animal accepting the gesture without hesitation, reflecting the trust he had cultivated through subtle actions rather than words. Across the street, a newsstand clattered as a man restocked papers, the rustling adding to the mosaic of urban sounds that James seemed to interpret instinctively, calculating movement, spacing, and timing in a way that hinted at a lifetime of attention honed by experience. A soft breeze stirred, lifting his coat slightly and brushing stray strands of hair across his forehead as he crouched to retrieve a loose coin near a drain. His movements economical, deliberate, each step a reflection of efficiency born from necessity. He adjusted the blanket beside him, ensuring it lay flat, as though maintaining order in his small corner of the world was both a ritual and a reassurance, a reminder of his dignity despite the circumstances surrounding him. Shadows shifted with the movement of pedestrians and the sunlight filtering through tall buildings, creating alternating patterns of brightness and shade across the pavement. Yet James seemed unaffected, navigating these changes with practiced ease, the calm measured in every breath. He stood finally, taking a moment to survey the street as if reading a map only he could interpret, noting the angle of incoming pedestrians, the movement of delivery carts, and the distant hum of traffic, all elements woven seamlessly into his awareness. The stray dog nudged his hand, prompting a brief smile that softened his rugged features, an expression that revealed patience, quiet observation, and humanity. James's eyes drifted toward the crosswalk where Robert Whitman had nearly stumbled earlier, remembering the moment of intervention with a sense of calm satisfaction, the memory reinforcing the balance between vigilance and action that defined his daily routine. The city pulsed around him, sounds layering and overlapping, yet within his small sphere, there was order, attention and readiness, a microcosm of careful observation that allowed him to remain present, responsive, and prepared for whatever unusual occurrence might come next, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of urban life while maintaining the quiet authority of someone who had long learned to see what others missed. Robert Whitman moved through the bustling streets with the sort of focus born from habit and urgency, his tailored suit slightly rumpled from the constant motion of a city that rarely paused, eyes scanning his phone and the surrounding sidewalks, gestures brisk and decisive, projecting the confidence and impatience of a man used to control. He paused outside a small cafe, adjusting his cufflinks while glancing at the entrance, the morning sun reflecting off the glass windows and catching the sharp lines of his face, emphasizing his determined expression. The sounds of the city, car horns, distant sirens, snippets of conversation, the shuffle of feet, formed a constant backdrop, yet his awareness filtered only what he deemed necessary for his path, ignoring subtle cues around him, including the familiar figure of James Carter across the street. Robert's hand brushed against the leather strap of his briefcase, a habitual gesture, while his eyes darted momentarily to the puddle reflecting neon signage, catching the distorted image of his own hurried movements. He exhaled lightly, a mixture of concentration and irritation, as a cyclist narrowly passed, the wheels spraying a thin arc of water onto the curb. Robert stepped aside, adjusting his tie, scanning the horizon for the next intersection, and noticing the faint movement of James approaching from the other side, blanket folded neatly under one arm, eyes steady and observant. He recognized the figure vaguely from the corner of his eye, yet did not consciously register it, absorbed in the rhythm of his own routine, unaware of the full significance of the man who had saved him moments ago. Inside, he rehearsed mental checklists scheduling the errands yet to be completed. Each thought measured precise, as he walked past newspaper stands, street vendors and clusters of commuters. Shadows of nearby buildings stretched across the sidewalk, catching his movement in sharp angular patterns, creating contrast with the soft warmth of sunlight reflecting off metallic surfaces of nearby cars and signage. Robert adjusted his briefcase again, tightening his grip, listening briefly to the distant laughter of children playing near a park entrance, an unnoticed backdrop to his internal calculations. He stepped up onto the curb with measured caution, crossing with care, while James approached from across the street, holding a small coffee cup and gesturing politely, the quiet acknowledgement of shared history and gratitude passing between them without spoken words. The noise of the city rose and fell rhythmically around them, the scent of roasted coffee beans mixing with the faint aroma of car exhaust, distant bakery breads, and wet pavement from an earlier drizzle, grounding them in an environment both ordinary and charged with subtle tension. Robert's eyes met James's briefly, a fleeting flash of recognition, curiosity, and perhaps cautious respect, yet he continued onward, adjusting his pace slightly, processing the unspoken cues, the subtle lessons conveyed through the previous encounter, realizing only faintly that the street, the crowd, and the ordinary city rhythm now held potential insights he had not previously considered, as every movement around him felt interconnected with the presence and awareness of someone who had long Learn to read the hidden patterns of the urban world. The city street glimmered under the bright midday sun, reflections bouncing off glass windows and metal railings, the hum of traffic punctuated by distant sirens and conversations. As James Carter navigated the sidewalk with quiet awareness, his dark coat blending with the shadows along the curb, blanket folded neatly beside him, hands steady and deliberate. He observed each passerby with practiced attention, noting subtle shifts in gait, glances and expressions, cataloging the environment with a precision that had been honed over years of living on the street. Across the avenue, Robert Whitman moved through the crowd, glancing up from his phone to check a street sign, briefcase held tightly at his side, brows slightly furrowed in concentration, unaware of the small gap forming between him and the flow of pedestrians, the uneven pavement and scattered puddles barely noticed in his focused hurry. James adjusted the position of a small cardboard cup near a utility pole, aligning it carefully to avoid being tipped over, the motion casual but deliberate, a gesture reflecting both attention and consideration for the space he occupied. The wind stirred faintly, carrying the smells of freshly baked bread from a nearby vendor, wet asphalt and distant car exhaust, blending into a sensory tapestry that James navigated instinctively, noticing the subtle tension in the city that most ignored. Robert's gaze shifted suddenly toward a glint in a puddle, a reflection catching his eye just as a briefcase slipped from his grasp, sending papers fluttering onto the wet pavement. James reacted instantly, moving with controlled precision, his dark eyes tracking the trajectory and guiding the briefcase back toward Robert's hands, fingers brushing lightly against the leather, motion calm yet perfectly timed, an unspoken signal that the minor mishap had been prevented without fanfare. The crowd moved around them, some slowing to watch, others passing by obliviously, the contrast between the hurried millionaire and the composed man on the street emphasizing the quiet mastery James possessed, a presence that had gone unnoticed until the precise moment it was needed. Sunlight fell in sharp angles across buildings and sidewalks, casting elongated shadows that highlighted the contours of faces, clothing and textures of the urban environment, emphasizing the subtle drama unfolding in what seemed an ordinary street corner. Robert straightened, a flicker of surprise and relief crossing his face as he glanced at James, the interaction brief but charged with unspoken acknowledgement, the first recognition of the attentiveness and presence that had prevented an incident. James allowed himself a small nod, almost imperceptible, maintaining the calm demeanor that had drawn him through countless similar days, while Robert adjusted his tie and briefcase, processing the encounter with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and emerging respect. The city continued its rhythm around them, footsteps and distant horns blending into a background hum. Yet within this small scene, a clear line had been drawn between observation, action, and consequence, highlighting how a single moment of awareness and readiness could shift perception and influence outcomes without spectacle, violence, or overt drama, creating a cinematic tension that simmered quietly, emphasizing character, environment, and the latent potential of human kindness and attentiveness in an urban landscape. The late morning sun glinted off the storefront windows, casting long warm reflections across the bustling sidewalk as James Carter moved carefully along the curb, his dark coat and folded blanket a subtle contrast against the bright cityscape. Each step was deliberate, guided by years of experience navigating the urban maze, his eyes constantly scanning for unusual movements, sudden obstacles, or glimpses of opportunity to assist those unaware of their surroundings. The smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery mixed with exhaust fumes and the faint scent of rain-dampened asphalt, layering the air with complexity that James absorbed instinctively, filtering distractions while remaining hyper-aware of the world around him. He paused near a trash can, rearranging discarded bottles and cans with quiet precision, ensuring that the little space he occupied retained some semblance of order, a reflection of both dignity and the discipline honed over decades. Across the street, Robert Whitman navigated the crowd with brisk steps, phone in hand, a mixture of urgency and focus etched across his face, his tailored jacket catching the sunlight at sharp angles, highlighting the tension and hurry of a man always moving toward obligations, seldom noticing the fine details of life that surrounded him. A sudden glint near a puddle drew Robert's gaze momentarily, and in that brief fraction of time, James stepped forward, his movements controlled, hands steady, intercepting a minor slip and guiding Robert's briefcase back into his grasp without startling anyone else. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, yet it conveyed calm authority and readiness, a quiet mastery of timing and space that contrasted sharply with the frantic energy of the pedestrian crowd. The dog at James's side shifted, ears pricked, alert to both the man's actions and the surrounding environment, reinforcing the sense of presence and attentiveness that defined the moment. Nearby vendors continued their routines, the sizzle of food on hot grills and the shuffle of newspapers from racks adding texture to the scene, yet the world seemed to contract and focus around the interaction, a bubble of awareness connecting the two men across the street. Robert's eyes flicked toward James, registering the quick intervention, a flash of recognition and curiosity passing through his expression, though he said nothing, letting the unspoken communication linger as he adjusted his tie and straightened his briefcase. Shadows shifted subtly as clouds passed overhead, sunlight diffusing into softer tones, highlighting textures in the pavement, reflections in the water, and the interplay of light on clothing and faces, creating a cinematic tableau that emphasized character, timing, and the human connections that often go unnoticed. James exhaled slowly, shoulders relaxing just enough to convey calm confidence, yet every movement remained intentional, as if rehearsed for countless small interventions that shaped the rhythm of the street. The moment stretched, rich with anticipation and unspoken understanding, a quiet dance of observation and action, illustrating how awareness and careful intervention could alter the flow of events in a city that otherwise ignored the subtleties of human interaction and the profound impact of simple acts performed at the right time. The city streets began to shift with the approach of early afternoon, the sun higher and warmer, casting long, sharp reflections across the glass fronts of buildings and glinting off metal surfaces along the sidewalks. James Carter, dark-skinned and composed, moved with quiet precision, scanning each corner, each group of pedestrians, noting subtle behaviors, gestures, and sounds that others ignored, his worn coat and neatly folded blanket marking him as someone overlooked by most but entirely aware of the life flowing around him. The smell of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe mixed with the faint tang of asphalt heated by the sun, and the occasional whiff of street food, layering the environment with a rich sensory tapestry that James absorbed instinctively. His hands adjusted a small stack of recycled newspapers and a cup left by a passerby, arranging them carefully on the curb as if maintaining order in a small universe he could control, a silent rhythm of attentiveness and respect for both objects and space. Across the street, Robert Whitman continued his purposeful stride, phone in hand, briefcase balanced neatly under his arm, eyes scanning for his next destination, a mixture of focus and habitual hurry etched across his face, his expression sharp yet unaware of the subtle interventions occurring in the space he passed through. A glint from a puddle caught Robert's attention briefly, and in that moment James shifted slightly, moving with calm decisiveness, subtly guiding the briefcase back toward him as if adjusting the flow of the street without drawing attention, his dark eyes calm, observant, and precise, reflecting years of honed awareness. The urban sounds, a distant car horn, the shuffle of pedestrians, the faint rustle of leaves in a city courtyard, provided a rhythm that James navigated perfectly, pausing only when necessary to anticipate potential disruptions, all while remaining unobtrusive to those around him. A stray dog followed, tail low, moving in synchronicity with James, ears alert to the street's subtle vibrations, reinforcing the sense of readiness and observation that defined the scene. Sunlight caught in the reflective surfaces of nearby windows, creating dynamic patterns of light and shadow across the pavement, emphasizing the contrast between the hurried movements of the city dwellers and the deliberate, measured pace of James. Robert adjusted his tie, exhaled lightly, and glanced around, registering James. For the first time with a flicker of recognition and curiosity, yet without breaking the cadence of his own path. The moment expanded subtly, the city's pulse providing both backdrop and counterpoint, highlighting the interplay of awareness, attention, and timing that James exercised effortlessly, transforming the ordinary street into a tableau of anticipation, quiet mastery, and potential intervention. Every element, the reflections, the ambient sounds, the scent of street vendors, the pattern of shadows, was part of an invisible choreography that James read instinctively, positioning him for what might come next, ready to act with precision and care, demonstrating the quiet power of observation and small gestures in a world that often overlooked those most capable of noticing what others missed. The afternoon crowd thickened as office workers spilled onto the sidewalks for lunch, their conversations blending into a constant murmur beneath the distant hum of traffic, and the occasional hiss of a city bus pulling away from the curb. James Carter remained near the corner where he had spent most of the morning, his dark eyes moving calmly across the flow of people, absorbing details others overlooked. A woman dropped a glove without noticing. A delivery driver struggled to balance several boxes while checking directions. A street musician adjusted the strings of an old guitar beneath the shade of a building awning. James noticed everything. Years on the street had taught him that survival depended less on strength and more on attention. The city rewarded those who saw the small things. Across the avenue, Robert Whitman emerged from a glass office tower, his expression tighter than before. The phone call he had just finished clearly had not gone well. He loosened his tie slightly and paused near the edge of the sidewalk, staring toward the traffic as if searching for answers among the moving vehicles. Sunlight reflected from nearby windows, flashing across his face in brief bursts of gold. James watched quietly. There was something different about Robert now. Earlier, he had moved through the city as though nothing around him mattered. Now his eyes wandered. He seemed distracted, thoughtful, perhaps even unsettled. The change was subtle, but James recognized it immediately. People often began noticing the world only after something interrupted their routine. A breeze drifted down the street, carrying the scent of coffee and roasted nuts from a vendor station near the subway entrance. The familiar smells mixed with the warm scent of concrete, baking beneath the afternoon sun. James adjusted the collar of his worn coat and glanced toward a construction site farther down the block. A temporary fence rattled lightly in the wind. Workers moved equipment inside while pedestrians flowed around the perimeter without paying attention. Most people never looked twice. James always did. His gaze shifted back toward Robert. The millionaire had stopped walking altogether. Instead, he stood watching the crowd, almost studying it. For the first time, he appeared curious about the people surrounding him. A young boy rushed past carrying a backpack nearly as large as his frame. An elderly woman struggled with several shopping bags. Robert's eyes followed them briefly. The city felt different when viewed slowly. James knew that better than anyone. Nearby, the stray dog that often accompanied him lifted its head and rested its chin against his knee. James scratched behind one ear absent-mindedly. The animal's calm presence grounded him. Across the street, Robert finally looked directly toward him. Their eyes met once more. This time neither looked away immediately. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. Something silent passed between them, a growing recognition that awareness itself could be valuable. The traffic light changed. People surged forward into the crosswalk. The moment ended. Yet as Robert continued walking, he glanced back once over his shoulder. James noticed. He noticed everything. And standing there amid the noise, sunlight, and endless motion of the city, he sensed that the strange feeling growing beneath the surface of the day had not reached its conclusion. It was only beginning. The afternoon sun began its slow descent between the towers of glass and steel, turning ordinary windows into sheets of molten gold, and stretching long shadows across the sidewalks. James Carter remained near the corner where the rhythm of the city seemed to converge, his eyes moving calmly from one detail to the next, observing the flow of pedestrians with the patience of someone who had learned that important things rarely announce themselves loudly. The stray dog rested beside him, occasionally lifting its head whenever a bus hissed to a stop or a bicycle bell echoed down the street. Around them, office workers hurried through their routines, clutching coffee cups, briefcases, and shopping bags, each carrying private concerns that seemed urgent to them and invisible to everyone else. Across the avenue, Robert Whitman slowed his pace for the second time that day. Earlier, he would have crossed the block without noticing a single face. Now his attention lingered. He watched a delivery driver help an elderly man lift a box. He noticed a street vendor handing an extra bottle of water to a construction worker without charging him. Small acts. Simple moments. The kinds of things he had spent years overlooking. The city suddenly appeared different when viewed through patience instead of speed. Robert adjusted his tie and paused outside a bank building, staring at his reflection in the polished glass. Behind his own image, he could see the movement of hundreds of strangers crossing the intersection. The reflection seemed symbolic somehow, though he could not explain why. He turned away and continued walking. Back on the corner, James noticed something unusual. A maintenance truck had stopped beside a utility access point near the curb. Two workers examined a metal panel while speaking quietly to one another. Most pedestrians ignored them completely. James did not. He watched the exchange carefully. One worker pointed toward a section of pavement several yards away. The other nodded. Neither appeared alarmed, but something about the interaction captured James's attention. Years of observation had taught him to trust instinct long before evidence appeared. The wind shifted. A newspaper page skidded across the sidewalk before catching against a storm drain. The smell of roasted coffee drifted from a nearby cafe. Traffic lights changed. People moved. Yet beneath the normal pulse of the city, James felt a faint sense of tension he could not quite define. Across the street, Robert stopped near the same block. He glanced down at his phone while waiting for a call. The crowd flowed around him like water around a stone. James's gaze shifted between the workers, the pavement, and Robert. The pieces did not fit together yet, but something inside him remained alert. A young woman accidentally bumped into Robert and apologized. He smiled politely and stepped aside. The reaction surprised even him. Hours earlier, he might have responded with irritation. Now he simply nodded and wished her a good afternoon. Small changes often arrived quietly. James noticed that too. The sunlight softened as clouds drifted overhead. For a brief moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. The workers packed their equipment and drove away. The intersection returned to normal. Yet James continued watching the exact spot they had examined. His expression remained calm, but his focus sharpened. Somewhere within the ordinary noise of the afternoon, a detail remained out of place. And while thousands of people continued walking without a second thought, James Carter could not shake the feeling that before this day was over, that small detail was going to matter. The afternoon gradually deepened into early evening, and the streets of the city were bathed in warm amber light as pedestrians hurried home or lingered outside cafes, their conversations blending with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional clatter of a delivery cart. James Carter remained near the same corner where he had spent much of the day, his dark eyes scanning the environment with a focused patience, observing details invisible to most. A loose grate shifting slightly under a passerby's foot, a newspaper page caught in the wind, the subtle exchange of glances between people passing each other. His coat was dusted lightly with the residue of the sidewalks he had traversed, the blanket tucked neatly beside him a symbol of order within his small domain. The city smelled of roasted coffee, fresh bread, and asphalt. Warmed by the late sun, layers of scent mingling with the faint breeze drifting between the tall buildings. Across the street, Robert Whitman, in his mid-40s and wearing a slightly rumpled suit, paused at the corner, adjusting his cufflinks and glancing toward James with a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Earlier in the day, he had moved through the city unaware, almost invisible, but now the memory of the minor intervention, the subtle guidance of his briefcase, the quiet awareness of the man on the street, seemed to resonate, prompting him to slow his pace and take in the scene more attentively. A child ran past carrying a school bag, narrowly missing bumping into Robert, and he instinctively stepped aside, noticing for the first time the small acts of coordination and consideration that happen daily on these streets without recognition. James observed all of it, noting the minutiae, the pattern of shadows falling across the sidewalk, the reflections in puddles, the gentle sway of a lamppost as the wind brushed past. He adjusted his position slightly, ensuring he remained aware of both the pedestrian flow and any potential irregularities, a practice honed through years of careful attention. The stray dog at his side shifted position, resting its chin lightly on his knee, its eyes alert yet calm, mirroring the rhythm of James's measured movements. Robert crossed the street slowly, glancing down at the spot where James had earlier intervened, feeling a faint sense of gratitude mingled with curiosity and an unaccustomed awareness of the man he had previously overlooked. The warm light softened the harsh angles of the urban architecture, casting long fluid shadows across the pavement, highlighting textures of brick, metal, and glass that had otherwise gone unnoticed. Every small detail, the tilt of a pedestrian's head, the pause of a street vendor adjusting an umbrella, the rustle of paper in the wind, seemed part of a larger pattern that James read effortlessly, his calm demeanor in sharp contrast with the flurry of motion surrounding him. Robert's footsteps slowed once more as he recognized the presence of someone whose attention could discern the unseen, whose subtle acts could alter the flow of events, and he allowed himself to watch quietly, absorbing the silent lesson of observation and awareness. The city continued its symphony around them, distant voices, the faint roar of a bus, a cyclist ringing a bell. Yet within the corner where James stood, time seemed to expand, allowing each movement, each glance, and each detail to settle into clarity, a moment of connection and anticipation waiting for the day's next shift. The late afternoon air carried a subtle chill as the sun began to dip behind the taller buildings, casting elongated shadows across the sidewalks and painting the city in soft hues of amber and rose. James Carter moved deliberately along the curb, his dark eyes sweeping the street with the calm alertness of someone who had learned to notice the unseen, his worn coat and neatly folded blanket signaling both humility and order in the midst of urban chaos. The scent of roasted coffee, warm pastries, and slightly damp asphalt mingled with the faint exhaust from passing cars, creating a layered atmosphere that James navigated instinctively, hands brushing lightly over small objects on the curb to ensure nothing shifted unintentionally. Across the avenue, Robert Whitman walked at a slower pace than usual, his sharp suit catching the last light of day and emphasizing the lines of his concentrated expression, his briefcase held securely yet with a relaxed grip, his gaze subtly drawn toward James, recognizing him from earlier encounters though not yet understanding the depth of the man's awareness. Pedestrians flowed around them like water around a stone, conversations punctuated by laughter, car horns, and distant sirens, yet within this stream, James moved with a rhythm tuned to the smallest details. The flicker of a paper in the wind, the uneven angle of a street grate, the glint of sun off a passing window, each subtle anomaly noted and accounted for. A street musician adjusted the strings of a guitar under a small awning, while a vendor restocked a stand of newspapers nearby, neither aware of the quiet observer whose presence lent an unspoken order to the space around him. James adjusted the position of a discarded coffee cup, ensuring it remained upright, the motion casual yet precise, a small act that reflected the patience and attention that had kept him alert and prepared through countless hours on these streets. Robert paused momentarily to tie a loose shoelace, and in that instant their eyes met, carrying recognition and curiosity without words, a subtle acknowledgement that attention could be as powerful as action, a bridge between two lives otherwise separated by circumstance. The stray dog at James's side shifted slightly, resting its chin on his knee, ears flicking toward the murmurs of the city, reinforcing the quiet sense of vigilance that pervaded the moment. Shadows shifted and softened as clouds drifted across the sky, sunlight catching glimmers off windows, puddles, and metallic surfaces, casting a cinematic interplay of light and shadow across the scene. James inhaled deeply, savoring the mixture of scents and sounds, his posture relaxed yet ready, each step deliberate, each glance purposeful, as if the city itself was a stage and he both observer and subtle conductor of its quiet movements. Robert continued along the sidewalk, glancing back once, a small frown of thoughtfulness crossing his face as he registered the patterns and attentiveness that James embodied. In that fleeting awareness, the ordinary urban environment seemed to hold a pause, stretching the moment into a study of human interaction, subtle recognition, and the latent impact of quiet attentiveness, where one small act could ripple across a day and perhaps alter its course entirely. The city settled into the golden hour, that brief stretch of time when the sunlight seemed softer, and every window reflected a warm glow across the streets below. James Carter sat quietly near the familiar corner, one hand resting on the stray dog beside him, his eyes following the movement of the crowd with the same careful attention that had guided him through countless days. Office workers streamed from buildings carrying laptops and coffee cups, couples emerged from restaurants, and tourists paused to photograph the skyline as it transformed beneath the fading light. To most people it was simply another evening. To James it felt different. The strange feeling that had followed him all afternoon remained. Across the avenue, Robert Whitman exited a building and stopped near the curb. His meeting had ended later than expected, but his mind was not on business. Several times during the afternoon, he had found himself thinking about the man on the corner. Not because of what he wore, not because of where he slept, because of how much he seemed to notice. Robert had spent years building companies, managing investments, and making decisions that affected thousands of people. Yet somehow a man with no office and no title appeared more aware of the world than anyone he had met that day. The thought lingered. A city bus pulled away from the curb with a hiss of compressed air. The sound echoed between the buildings. James glanced toward the section of pavement he had been watching since earlier. The maintenance workers were gone, but something still bothered him. A faint vibration seemed to travel through the metal grate near the curb. Most people would never notice it. James did. His gaze narrowed slightly. The dog lifted its head. Across the street, Robert waited for the signal to change before crossing. The crowd gathered beside him. A woman carrying grocery bags. Two teenagers laughing over something on a phone. An elderly man using a cane. Ordinary people finishing ordinary days. James stood slowly. The blanket slid from his lap. The movement caught Robert's attention immediately. For the first time all day, James looked concerned. Not frightened. Concerned. There was a difference. The sunlight reflected across a puddle near the curb, creating a ripple of gold. James studied the pavement again. Then he took several steps forward, moving closer to the intersection. Robert watched him. Something about the man's focus made him stop checking his phone. Around them, the city continued its rhythm. Traffic lights changed. Conversations rose and fell. Yet beneath the noise, a strange stillness seemed to settle over the moment. James trusted instinct. Instinct had protected him more times than he could count. He glanced once toward Robert. There. Eyes met across the avenue. This time the connection lasted longer. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Robert could see it clearly now. James was not reacting to fear. He was reacting to observation. He had noticed something. The question was what? The crowd began moving as the crossing signal appeared. People stepped forward together. James remained still, watching. The fading sunlight painted the street in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang the hour. And as hundreds of footsteps echoed across the intersection, both men felt the same thing. The day was approaching a turning point. Whatever James had noticed was no longer a passing concern. It was becoming impossible to ignore. The crossing signal flashed and the crowd began moving forward in a steady wave. Shoes tapping against concrete, conversations blending into the familiar soundtrack of the city. James Carter remained motionless near the curb, his attention fixed on the section of pavement that had been bothering him all afternoon. The faint vibration was still there. Subtle. Almost impossible to notice. Yet after years of surviving on the streets, he had learned that small details often carried the biggest warnings. The stray dog beside him suddenly stood and took several uneasy steps backward. James noticed that too. Across the intersection, Robert Whitman slowed. He had been ready to cross with everyone else, but something about James's expression stopped him. It was not fear. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that comes only from paying attention when everyone else is distracted. The golden light of sunset reflected from nearby windows, bathing the street in warm color. People continued walking. The elderly man with the cane moved carefully. The woman carrying grocery bags adjusted her grip. Two teenagers laughed without noticing anything unusual. James stepped away from the wall and moved closer to the edge of the sidewalk. His eyes remained fixed on the pavement near the utility access point that maintenance workers had inspected earlier. Then he saw it. A slight shift. Barely visible. A small section of metal edging had loosened and lifted, unevenly above the surrounding surface. To most people it would have looked insignificant. To James it explained everything. The vibration. The workers. The uneasy feeling. The area was becoming unstable beneath the constant pressure of thousands of footsteps. Without hesitation, James raised his voice. "Hold up a second." The words carried farther than he expected. Several pedestrians glanced toward him. Most kept moving. Robert stopped completely. Their eyes met across the intersection. This time Robert trusted what he saw. He stepped back instead of forward. The movement caused the woman beside him to pause as well. A few others hesitated. The flow of people slowed. The moment lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. A transit employee standing nearby noticed the unusual hesitation and followed James's gaze toward the pavement. He walked over to inspect it. The man's expression changed immediately. He pulled out a radio and began speaking quickly. Within moments, city workers arrived and redirected pedestrians around the affected area, while additional personnel examined the site. The crowd shifted course with mild confusion but little concern. Most people never learned why they had been rerouted. They simply continued with their evening. Robert remained where he stood, watching James. The realization settled over him slowly. If James had ignored that feeling, ignored that tiny detail, ignored what everyone else overlooked, dozens of people would have continued walking across a section of pavement that required immediate attention. No headlines would celebrate what happened. No cameras had recorded it. Yet Robert understood the truth. James had seen something important because he paid attention when no one else did. The city workers continued their inspection while twilight deepened across the skyline. Street lights flickered on one by one. The dog returned to James's side and sat quietly. Robert crossed the street at last. He stopped a few feet away from James and looked at him differently than before. Not with pity, not with curiosity, with respect. And for the first time all day, neither man looked like a stranger to the other. Twilight settled gently over the city, softening the sharp edges of skyscrapers and turning the glass towers into mirrors of deep blue and fading gold. Streetlights flickered awake one after another, casting warm pools of light across sidewalks that had finally begun to quiet after the rush of the day. James Carter remained near the corner where everything had unfolded, his blanket folded neatly beside him and the stray dog resting peacefully at his feet. The tension that had followed him since morning had disappeared, replaced by the familiar stillness he often found in the final hours of daylight. Across the street, city workers continued examining the section of pavement, while pedestrians moved safely around the area. Most people passed without ever knowing why the route had changed. To them, it was simply another city inconvenience. To Robert Whitman, it was something entirely different. He stood beside James for several moments without speaking. The sounds of the city seemed quieter now. A distant train rattled somewhere beyond the buildings. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby cafe preparing for the evening crowd. The cool breeze carried the smell of rain that had not yet arrived. Finally, Robert broke the silence. "How did you know?" His voice was calm, stripped of the urgency and confidence that had defined him earlier. James looked toward the street where the workers remained gathered. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I pay attention." Robert nodded slowly. The answer sounded simple, but somehow it explained everything. He looked down at his polished shoes and then back toward the city. Thousands of people had crossed that block every day. Hundreds had walked through that intersection during the afternoon. Yet only one person had noticed the tiny details that everyone else ignored. Not because he was lucky, not because he was important, because he was present, truly present. The realization settled heavily in Robert's chest. For years he had measured success through numbers, meetings, schedules, and achievements. Yet standing beside a man with almost nothing, he felt as though he had learned one of the most valuable lessons of his life. James reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. The animal responded with a content sigh. Nearby, a cafe employee stepped outside and placed a cup of hot coffee on the ledge beside James. No words were exchanged. The gesture seemed routine, familiar. Robert noticed that too. Throughout the day he had watched strangers acknowledge James in small ways. A nod from a vendor, a smile from a crossing guard, a free cup of coffee. Respect earned quietly over time. The city knew him better than Robert had realized. Robert reached into his pocket and removed a business card. He hesitated before offering it. "If you ever want to talk," he said, "or if there is anything I can do." James accepted the card politely. He did not examine it. He simply slipped it into his coat pocket and nodded. The gesture carried gratitude without dependence, dignity without pride. The streetlights reflected in puddles along the curb, creating ribbons of gold across the dark pavement. People continued moving through the city, each carrying stories invisible to everyone around them. Robert looked at James one final time before preparing to leave. This morning he had seen a homeless man. Tonight he saw something entirely different. A man who noticed what others missed. A man whose quiet awareness had protected strangers who would never know his name. A man whose kindness asked for nothing in return. As Robert disappeared into the evening crowd, James remained on the corner beneath the glow of the streetlights. The dog rested beside him. The city breathed around him. And for the first time all day, everything felt exactly where it belonged.